Hello and welcome to the Russia Question. I'm Michael Ossorgin, Director of the Russian Program at Fordham University at Lincoln Center. This webinar is one of the many initiatives of Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center, which facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world, broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We encourage you to follow us on YouTube and share this and other videos with anyone you might benefit who might benefit from them. Today we are joined by Professor Michael R. Katz. Welcome, Professor Katz.
Thank you.
Professor Michael R. Katz has taught Russian language and literature at Williams College, the University of Texas at Austin, and Middlebury College, where he is currently the C.V. Starr Professor Emeritus of Russian and East European Studies. He's written 2 books about 19th century Russian literature and translated over 20 Russian novels into English, several never before translated. He is retired and lives in Cornwall, Vermont with his wife. Michael, I'd like to turn to you and allow you to give us an introduction to your work. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. I love talking about it. It was a labor of love, my favorite novel by Dostoevsky, and one of the classics of world literature. I got interested in it when I was 15 years old and have read it and taught it and written about it many times, and decided that it was time for me to take it on as a translation project. I wrote a piece for Lit Hub called COVID and Dostoevsky, and that was supposed to be a vaguely humorous title. I thought of calling it From COVID to Dostoevsky, because it was COVID that was looming, and it looked like it was going to be a couple of years that it would take to play itself out. And I wanted to have a project that would take me through that time. The college, as I'm sure Fordham did too, pretty well shut down. There were no more concerts, lectures, films, events. So I wanted to have something to do to keep me lively. And I chose to translate Karamazov. Who knew how long COVID was going to last? Who knew how long the translation was going to take? But I worked on it for 3 years, and it was published almost a year ago, July 2023, in hardback, and it will soon be issued in paperback, and then it will become the basis of a new Norton Critical Edition with essays, letters by the author, critical works, which I'm also excited about. I'm co-editing that with a woman from Northwestern, and we've gone through all the essays, we've selected them, and it will be appearing in 2025. Let's see. Is that enough of an introduction, or you want more? Okay.
Well, just a word to our audience as far as our format's concerned. We'll begin today's discussion with a few questions I have for our guests, and then at any moment you can enter questions into the Q&A. I'll read them aloud following my discussion with Professor Michael Katz. And a quick addendum to that for today's audience, some of whom are my current students of the Brothers Karamazov seminar that I'm holding at Fordham, and we are 95% completed with the novel. So if I see that your question pertains to those last 5%, which is roughly the last, 6 chapters of the trial or beyond, that includes the epilogue, then I'll withhold those questions until the last 15 minutes so that we don't have any dreaded plot spoilers for our students.
Right.
Great. And so, Michael, I would like to know how do you sit down to translate, just in a practical sense, and what do you consider indispensable resources for 19th century literature translations?
Well, as you may know from some emails that we've had, I work early in the morning. I get up at about 5,
Hmm.
5 a.m., make my coffee, and go downstairs to my study, where I translate about a page or a page and a half every day. I rarely vary from that routine. When I'm away from home, I edit uh, material that I've already translated. But in terms of resources, I think I have every dictionary known to man and woman, Russian, English, English, Russian, Russian dictionaries, and I have dictionaries of idioms, dictionaries of sayings and proverbs. Uh, I have online dictionaries, the 17-volume magnificent Academy of Sciences from the Soviet Union. Their dictionary is now online, and I have Vosmer and Dai and all sorts of resources. I also have two human resources. I have a Russian native speaker who is a former lecturer at Middlebury, and she gracefully reads every one of my drafts and compares my draft with the original Russian. And she has suggestions and corrections which she makes. Actually, she has a system of exclamation points. If I make a simple error, she puts one exclamation point. If it's a more complicated error, she puts two. If it's a howler and I should know better, she puts three exclamation points and writes, "See me." And then we have a conference. I'm humiliated because I missed something important, and we go on from there. My second human resource is a senior colleague of mine who is the former editor of the New England Review, who's an excellent editor, reader, and critic of world literature. And he reads not the whole thing, but he reads parts of it that I send him, and he too makes corrections and suggestions of the English. So it's really a team effort, and I'm very grateful for both my resources, human and the literary resources. I couldn't do it without those.
It only seems fitting that the translation process of Dostoevsky would be dialogic. So I approve.
It makes sense,
And there's nothing
right?
wrong with being sort of mildly humbled on occasion. I know there's a big connection between humility and truth in the novel.
Absolutely.
Humus, even Paul Cantino writes about the sort of humus being at the root of humility, connecting to the earth, right?
Mhm.
In Latin. But I think it's at least a pertinent way of describing the sort of closeness of earth and humility and the truth that comes out of that. So good on your translator for those three exclamation points on occasion. I doubt that there are too many
Right,
of
not
them.
too often.
Um, so secondly, I of course I do, and I'm sure you do greatly respect translators who've come before you. But did you find existing translations needing critical revision? And does this factor into your motivation for translating, or are you perhaps more like Ivan, whom the narrator describes in the Brothers Karamazov as having to get an idea straight? Is the decision to translate more personal than corrective?
That's a good question. And I really divide the works that I've translated over my career into three categories. The first category is something that's never been translated before, and I think it deserves to be known better by the non-Russian speaking world. For example, the first book I translated was Alexander Herzen's novel, Ktovi Navai, Who is to Blame or Who is Guilty. It's all sometimes translated. Excuse me. And that had never been translated. Since then, it's been translated by other people, but that was the first book I did, and it was untranslated at the time. Second category is what you're describing, a book which has been translated, often more than once, but is, in my opinion, not well served by its translation. A good example was Chernyshevsky's notorious novel, What Is to Be Done, Что делать? That had been translated twice shortly after he wrote the book in the 1880s, once by an American anarchist who didn't know any Russian and who translated it from German, and the second time by a translator who did know Russian, but knew it not so well. And Tolstoy wrote to him and asked him to stop translating his works because he didn't like his translations. His name was Nathan Haskell Dole. And I found that his translation was defective, that it made mistakes. When it didn't know a word, it left it in Russian. He left out the conclusion because he said in his preface he didn't understand it. So things like that marred his translation. So that was the book that I translated where I was unhappy with the existing versions. And the third category is when a publisher asks me to undertake a critical edition, where I get to choose letters, newspaper articles by contemporaries, and critical reviews, modern, Russian, American, European, and can assemble the apparatus for that novel. So those are the three categories. For Karamazov, it had been translated several times. The most common ones still in publication were Constance Garnett, who translated everything, over 70 books into English, and was responsible for popularizing Russian literature. And the other is the team, the Russian-American team of a Russian-British team, Pavir Volokonsky, Richard Pavir and I forget Volokonsky's first name, but they worked together. Sorry, Larissa?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh. They've worked together and have produced quite a few volumes. I find their translations a bit clunky. The syntax tends to be very Russian instead of English, and they sort of forget that they're writing for an American and an English audience. So I decided that with those two, the major translations, that Karamazov could use another version. I had finished Crime and Punishment, and people thought that it was successful. So I decided I would tackle Karamazov. That took, as I said, 3 years.
Excellent. So, I always preface any talk about Constance Garnett with what you've said, which is that basically maybe the Russian departments that as we know them would not exist without her, such as our debt to her for the enormous amount of translating that she did of Russian literature generally, and broadly speaking into English. And Pavir Volkonsky, I'm personally indebted to for opening up the novels in exactly the sort of literal Russian ways that you described, and for their annotations. And I also noticed that because as I'm teaching it, I'm also reading Victor Terrace's companion to the Brothers Karamazov, and I noticed that there's a dialogue between you in your notes and Victor Terrace. Is that something you worked with regularly? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It was a very valuable resource. I should have mentioned him before. But
you do in your book, and it shows it. He's an incredible reader of the book, and opens up in all sorts of interesting ways. And I think you're judicious in your selection of what to include from that book as well. But again, you turned it into something dialogic, which I think is fitting for a Dostoevsky project between all of those translators and commentators. And the result is really exquisite. So you write about being a non-practicing Jew in the Lit Hub article. how do you approach Dostoevsky's anti-Semitic sections as a translator and teacher of the novel over many years?
With a heavy heart. Uh,
Mm,
when I meet him in the great beyond, I will challenge his beliefs about Yids and Jews. I find it very difficult to translate the passage, for example, where Fyodor Pavlovich has gone to Odessa and makes the acquaintance of Yids, dirty little Yids, and Yidkins, and ends up even by knowing some Jews. Dostoevsky's distinction between lower class, dirty Yids and middle or upper class Jews is extraordinary. He wrote an article in which he said he doesn't distinguish between those two words. That's not true, Fyodor Mikhailovich, I mean. Um, he does distinguish between those two words, and Yid is a derogatory epithet. There's no doubt about it, and that's the way he uses it. But I find it hard to work on those passages. I was once giving a talk to the Hillel Society at Williams College on Parents' Weekend, and there were lots of mothers and fathers of Jewish undergraduates sitting in my audience. And when I finished my talk about Dostoevsky's anti-Semitism, one woman raised her hand and said, "Professor Katz, what's a nice Jewish boy like you doing with a topic like this?" And I said, "Good question. I find that it's intriguing that a great genius who has so many wonderful ideas about faith and love, and Father Zosima's sermons and teachings can be so anti-Semitic. And I am puzzled by it, and I share my puzzlement with my audience." And she said, "Well, thank you, but it's difficult." I said, "I know."
absolutely. I think there's no getting around how difficult it is. And with a heavy heart, I think is the right approach in the sort of here and beyond. Oddly enough, we're covering the section where the prosecutor speaks about how there are so many premature deaths, suicides counted at the time in Russia without giving any thought, like Hamlet, to what lies beyond, right? But
Yeah,
I suppose
yeah,
that you're not among those young Russian radicals of the 19th century, and I don't think neither am I, and certainly neither is Dostoevsky. I don't know if this speaks to you, but I know that Joseph Frank, also Jewish, who devoted an enormous amount of his life to writing 5 volumes. I mean, just incredibly detailed volumes. So much so that David Foster Wallace ended up writing a separate essay devoted to how amazing Joseph Frank's work was on or is on Dostoevsky, and contextualizing it. And, like you, it does not deter, these moments do not deter you from valuing what is
mhm,
of value in the novel. And I don't think that you're alone. I know Joseph Frank describes him as a guilty anti-Semite.
right.
And there's the sense that he even senses what he's doing is wrong, and works to correct it in other ways, but it is not to apologize for what is clearly anti-Semitism in the novel.
Yes, I agree. I
Well,
think I think that I have to myself come up with what I think is the reason for his anti-Semitism,
mm,
which I can share with you
please,
if you like.
please.
And that is that he viewed the Russian nation as the Christ-bearing, God-bearing nation, and capable of uniting all of mankind in these universal truths of Christendom. But for some reason or other, the Jews have always viewed themselves as the quote chosen people, and the Jews, in spite of all the efforts of humanity for the last 4,000 years, have tried to eliminate the Jews, and the Jews persist in surviving. Anti-Semitism, the Inquisition, of course, the Holocaust, the latest upsurge of anti-Semitism in our own United States. The Jews don't go away. Here we are still. And for Dostoevsky, this posed an ideological problem. How could Russia be the God-bearing universalist nation if the Jews still exist? And I think he couldn't deal with that. And his way of expressing his hostility was anti-Semitism.
Fair, and troubling and accurate answer, I think, thank you for including that. I want to ask about more specific words in the translation.
Mm-hmm.
They are what we might call load-bearing
Right.
in others, insofar as they prove structurally vital, but also thematically prevalent. These include words like, but certainly not limited to, chior, nadriv, podlitz, shut, right? I'll let you explain the differences if you would like. Enoch versus Manach, right? As one who is sort of other and apart for being other versus Manach, maybe more emphasis on monos or being alone. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a kind of distinction between Ferapont and Zosima, right? Different or peculiar versus one and isolated. In any case, all of these important words have bearing on the plot and the structure of the novel as a whole, and they appear alone and in pairs. Which of the novel's words are particularly load-bearing in your estimation, and how do you approach them in translation across the length of the novel?
Well, the hardest thing is to be consistent.
Hmm.
Over the course of 3 years and an 800-page novel, to make sure that I translate the same, that word, each time it appears. Fortunately, searches on the computer have simplified matters a bit, so you can look up the synonyms and see whether you've erred and varied your choice. Of the ones you list, and I agree, you've got a good list of problems. The one that is the most difficult to deal with is nadrif. And I looked at the other translations. Constance Garnett calls it laceration, and Fyodor Dostoevsky, I believe, calls it a rupture. And both of those have their devotees. I've looked at synonym dictionaries and find break, split, tearing, all sorts of synonyms, and decided that Constance Garnett's lacerations is really the best way to go. I've had correspondence with several colleagues who say, you're going to keep that, aren't you? So I think the field is, as it were, wedded to Constance Garnett's choice. And it plays such an important role in book 4, where 3 of the chapters are called lacerations in different locations. So I decided to go with her choice. I should have said before, when I was talking about Garnett and Fyodor Dostoevsky, that I view translation to some extent as a collaborative enterprise. That I do consult other translations, sometimes just to see how they did it wrong, and then I do what I think is right in mine. But if they've come up with a good word, like laceration, I can't choose an inferior word just because they got there first. So I use their word, and I thank in the acknowledgments, my predecessors who have translated the work before me. And I expect that my successors, when they retranslate it, hopefully not for a long time, will borrow what they think is good from mine, and I won't be upset.
I'll remember that when 30 years from now I'm doing my translation of the
Okay,
book. That you gave me permission.
I do.
Um, well, yeah, I was wondering actually, because of the burden that the sheer length of the novel places on memory, whether you would avail yourself of the search feature and sort of see all of the points that they appear and try to synchronize without necessarily translating them identically. Did you find that that had to be the case?
Well, there are different kinds of repetition. If the word is nadrif, which is semantically loaded, I make sure to keep it consistent. If it's a different word, chort, for example, which is sometimes satana and sometimes bies and sometimes diablo. I mean, there are different words for the devil. And if Dostoevsky can use different words to describe that character, then I can too. I don't have to say the devil each time. So the search function is very helpful. But it does call on me to make personal judgments about whether a specific word is semantically loaded or just a repetition.
I can't pass up on the opportunity to dip into a question that was given to me by student Helen Petrovskaya, who's reading along with us in Russian and in your translation. And she touches on this point. There appears to be no English equivalent for the word chur, right? But it is typically translated as devil.
Right.
However, in Russian, distinctions exist between chur, diavol, demon,
Yeah.
and bies. Recognizing that in Russian, cherti are hierarchically placed below the devil and demons, which indicates the cherti are the lowest class in the hierarchy of hell. And so she asks an interesting question. Do you think English readers partially miss the irony that it is Chor, or the lowest creature from hell, that comes to Ivan and not the devil?
I do. I think English readers miss it. Had I known that, I would have put a footnote to that effect.
Well,
It's a very good point.
we won't mind if you put it in the Norton Critical Edition.
Okay, good.
I'm sure Helen wouldn't. Thank you, Helen. Let's see. One more question, and we can move to our audience. Of course, I
Okay.
have several, several more if needed. What liberties do you allow yourself to make a good English text? Do you break up Dostoevsky's interminable paragraphs and sentences? For example, Maguire's and Mayer's Fyodor Dostoevsky translations feature them intact. Do you see them as an instrumental part of Dostoevsky's style?
I think the semicolon is my favorite punctuation mark. And Dostoevsky uses it, but I use it more. So I tend to divide his long sentences into manageable units, either by ending a sentence and starting a new one or using a semicolon. I don't disturb his paragraph structure. If there's a long paragraph, I let it go as one paragraph, but I do divide the sentences. I think that it just is because Russian is so highly inflected, you don't have the same kind of trouble as you have in English figuring out what goes with what. So relative clauses, gerunds, participles in Russian, all of which are, well, not gerunds aren't declined, but participles and names and adjectives are all declined. So you can tell pronouns what goes with what. In English, it doesn't work like that. We have our set pronouns and they don't change with gender and number. So you have to make it clear. Clarity is crucial in a translation. And Dostoevsky, sometimes I got asked, I was teaching Karamazov, and somebody said to me, who is saying this? because it didn't say said so and so. And I had to stop and reread the page to figure out who's the speaker. And I did, I could. And he said, "Why didn't you say that?" I said, "Because Dostoevsky doesn't say that." And I think he's looking for that uncertainty, that you're not sure in the hubbub of the discussion going on who's speaking.
And if you have survived the Russian program to the point of receiving your minor, then you'll have a perfect sense of each of those terms that Professor Katz is describing. One more reason, frankly, to hang on.
I'm sure that's true.
Yes. Kenneth Scher is asking if you might give an example of the difference between your translation and a Piotr Volkonsky translation that springs to mind. Do you have one?
Well, the rupture, laceration
Pardon, yeah.
rupture,
Hmm.
is the one that springs most to mind. Um, it's been a while since I looked at Pavir, so I'm afraid I can't do better than that. I'd have to look at it again, and I'm
Right.
sure I could come up with something.
Hmm. But they tend to be, on the whole, in your estimation, literal, and have a Russian phrasing, is what you had mentioned earlier,
Right.
as
Hmm.
opposed to an English, which has its advantages. I mean, when I don't know what you think about Nabokov's translation of Pushkin, where in a way what it's doing is trying to sort of enter you into that world as someplace other than what is the English world or what would be an English translation. And
Right.
Pavel Volkansky do an amazing job of sort of taking you there in that sense. But then there's the question of, well, how would I say this in English in a way that holds the sort of same poetic weight? Is that fair?
I think it is. And I think Nabokov's Pushkin is of value to Slavists, not so much to someone just wanting to get an idea of what Eugene Onegin is like.
Right? Or not somebody who's just interested in the pleasure of reading
Right.
that matter, right? I mean, well, what kind of pleasures of reading, I don't know.
Mhm.
Like you say, it's absolutely amazing in certain rights, but not for its readability
Right.
as a
Right.
translation. That's pretty commonly universally accepted, and he acknowledges that at the outset, right? So we have an anonymous attendee who asks, what strains, speaking of Nadriv, and questions in the Brothers Karamazov can be seen in the current Russian autocracy and Ukraine war?
Well, Dostoevsky, it's easier to look at Dostoevsky's Pushkin speech, which he gave at the end of his life, um, wrote it just months before he died, in which he propagates a universalist idea for the Russian nation. And I think that Putin uses that sort of nationalist, chauvinist, almost militarist approach in envisioning a Russian empire, which includes all of the former Soviet Union, and not just Belarus and Ukraine, but the former stands are now independent countries, the Baltic countries, and so on. I think Dostoevsky would probably approve of Putin's mission. I don't know about the war. Unlike Tolstoy, who was such a pacifist, Dostoevsky is, it's hard to read what his approach would be to the militarism that Putin is now following. I would like to think he wouldn't approve, but I don't know.
Right, we don't know. We this runs into the problem of what sort of is written in Dostoevsky's journals, and rather nonfiction versus what's written in his fiction, partly, right?
Right,
Where there are some justifications of militarization in the journals, but then they're so convincingly refuted in his novels.
right,
The
right,
justifications for those, right? Which takes you to this place of just shrugging your shoulders, like, well, how can, similar to the anti-Semitic problems that he raises. How can somebody I'm so indebted to for such a beautiful moral vision have these blind spots also, right? I mean,
Yes.
I suppose in the trial that we're reading right now, the prosecutor says that what the Karamazovs stand poised between two abysses, right? And there's a sense in which you feel that directly in Dostoevsky as an author and in his novels that he contains contradictions,
Yes.
uh,
Hmm.
and yet this kind of nastiness that we perceive in moments is, to my mind, pummeled by other things, right? Not erased, not non-existent, but overwhelmed, I'll say, by these other moments. Fair, would
Yes,
you?
I agree. Hmm.
Um, let's see. Peter Eliopoulos asks, picking up on the anonymous query, he cites a book, Why Read Moby Dick? And he'll apply to it here. Why read the Brothers Karamazov versus, say, Winston Churchill or others' take on the Ukrainian-Russian recidivist dictatorship?
Well, I would say it isn't an either or, but it's a both and. Read read Winston Churchill and read Dostoevsky and make up your own mind. I'm sure there are things of value in each that would help you understand the situation. Very often with the canon, the arguments about the literary canon, should a course in world literature include the great classic dead white males, or should they include people of color, women, um, whatever in the syllabus? And my answer is that shouldn't be an either or, it should be both. You want to have both standard classics and you want to have both so-called relevant modern literature. And I know that time is of the essence in making up a course and a syllabus, but I think that's the fair answer to that question.
That makes sense to me, and I'm if I could add to it, I think that in the novel there is a question about the relationship between church and state that reappears. It sort of begins with Ivan's very ambiguous article about church and state, where nobody knows
Right?
where Ivan stands, and he likes it that
Right?
way, and he feels ambiguous about it at some profound level. Uh, and on the one hand, the Dostoevsky of the journals might sort of push us into an understanding of the church and state as this kind of millenarian vision, where the church is absorbed, or the church absorbs the state into itself in this kind of, I don't know, bold seizing of power in a way. But on the other hand, again, Father Paisi describes it very differently in the novel,
Yes,
where by virtue of being apart from and outside of the state and unlike the state, it's a utopic vision to be sure. I mean, but it's a non-military one, that's for sure. Also, by virtue of being apart from it and outside of it and unlike it in its sort of abusive father-like tendencies, then it can actually stand as something that draws the state towards it, right? And in that sense, there's a kind of relationship without having it to be like, church becomes state or state becomes
right.
church.
Hmm.
So again, those Dostoevsky houses those contradictions. Would that be fair to say?
I think so.
We have, let's see, a couple more questions here. That I
Bring them
would.
on.
Okay, great. In the piece you published on LitHub, you also write about how you first read The Brothers Karamazov when you're 15, and have taught and thought about the novel a lot since then. So you've touched on this in your introduction, but what role do scholarship and your own experience with the work play in the act of translating?
Well, excuse me. My own experience is directly relevant to the choice of books I translate. So the questions that Dostoevsky raises and the sermons and teachings of Father Zosima and the temptation to be swept away by the arguments of the Grand Inquisitor are relevant to me as an individual. I went through a strong atheist rebellion against my childhood faith and wound up now in a position of atheism and uncertainty about such matters. Say again the second half of your question.
Well, yeah, how does that
Oh,
how does that
scholarship.
play into, yeah, what role does
Yeah.
scholarship in your own experience with the work play in the act of translation?
Yeah, the scholarship is crucial, and I'm glad that you cited Joseph Frank's book. I have all 5 volumes and I consult them. And certainly I'm now, as I mentioned to you before, translating Dostoevsky's Idiot and have just read the volume that Frank devotes, half a volume that Frank devotes to that novel. And his scholarship has been extremely useful, indispensable for me. So it's the combination of personal experience and scholarship that assist me in my task.
May I ask a little bit about what drew you to the Idiot? For the audience sake, one of the explicitly stated motivations of Dostoevsky's for writing the Idiot was to, in his words, translated, create the image of a positively beautiful person, right? And he speaks about that having happened, most perfectly expressed according to Dostoevsky in the Gospels. Secondly, in other Christian literature, which he includes Don Quixote in and Pickwick, Dickens' Pickwick.
Right.
He says, but these ones rely a bit too much on humor, where I want a character that people have to take seriously. He doesn't end up, he ends up not being able to do that entirely.
That's
But
correct.
what was it in particular about the Idiot? I was drawn to it and still fascinated with it. What drew you to it?
Well, a practical point as well as a spiritual point. The practical point is it's the only major novel by Dostoevsky that I haven't translated. And when I finished Karamazov, I put a call out on the Slavic listserv, which is called Sealangs. And I said, dear colleagues, I finished my translation of Karamazov, and I'm looking for suggestions for another project. And I got all sorts of suggestions, most of which I'd never heard of. Mid-19th century novels, a nihilist novel, an anti-nihilist novel, an anarchist novel, and I looked at all of them. I got them out of the library and went through them, and I said, none of them is exactly right. Having just come off Karamazov, I didn't feel like doing something that was, as my graduate students used to say at Texas, a bad but important novel. I've done enough bad but important novels in my life. I wanted a good but important novel, and The Idiot was just there for the taking. I got into it again, and I was fascinated by the whole question of physical illness versus mental illness, of faith versus doubt, the wonderful line by Dostoevsky that his faith was tempered in a furnace of doubt. For sure, that is the theme of The Idiot. And Prince Myshkin, as you point out, both a Jesus figure and a Don Quixote figure. The humor is there. I just translated yesterday the section where General Ivolgin, Ganya's father, is talking about this incident on the train where an aristocratic woman objects to the fact that he's smoking a cigar in his train compartment. And she walks up to him, takes the cigar out of his hand, and tosses it out the window. She's sitting with a lapdog on her lap in the train compartment, and without saying anything, he walks up to her, takes two fingers, grabs the lapdog by the scruff of its neck, and tosses it out the window after the cigar. It's one of the funniest scenes in all of Dostoevsky.
Oh,
It's
no.
Nastasia Filipovna looks at him and he says, "Oh, you monster." And everybody bursts out laughing. That sort of humor is just wonderful. It's so much fun to translate.
Right, and in addition to, I guess, the sort of ill-fittedness of a quixotic character with the world, right? And those
Yes.
inevitable sort of clashes or slips that Don Quixote ends up being actually an incredibly violent book as a result of the ill-fittedness of ideology into the world, which just is completely different from it in the most brute physical way, right?
He and Jesus share that in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not necessarily a peaceful return to Russia for
Right.
Mushkin, despite all of
That's
his
right.
morally beautiful attempts, right? Well, I wanted to give us a chance to speak about the end of the novel. So, for those of you who are attending who are not interested in plot spoilers, I'll give you a second to log off. That includes my students with whom, if you weren't here earlier, we'll be finishing the book in about 2 weeks. So along those lines, I remember when you visited, you popped a question in the Q&A about, or a comment in the Q&A of an event that I held with Paul Cantino and Terry Tilley. And you had asked, somebody had said, well, the final words of the novel, maybe it was me, are hurrah for Karamazov. And you pointed out that it's the second to last line of the novel. Is that right?
That's
Can you
correct.
speak a little bit about
That's,
what that means and what, and to your mind, is it a hurrah for Karamazov the whole, or is it specifically Alyosha?
I think it's specifically Alyosha, and
Mm,
that's what's wrong with it. Um, just like the boys, after Kolya brings Zhuchka, resurrected Zhuchka, Pidizvon, back to Ilyusha, what the boys say is, "Hurrah for Kolya." And Dostoevsky is not happy with that. That is personalizing the messenger.
mm,
And Dostoevsky sees the truth as something which occurs not through the intermediary of the priest, the messenger, but rather to the communion, to the whole group. So the last words of the novel are, and they all joined in, or they all chimed in. I forget how I translated it. But the point is, all the boys are chiming in. And it is the communal aspect of the manifestation of truth, which is what Dostoevsky is highlighting. So I think uh, Constance Garnett was well-meaning when she said "hurrah for Karamazov." I've used it myself as praise for the novel, as if the author is taking a bow and saying, "Didn't I do a great job?" You did, but the last lines are important, and you don't change the last line of a novel because you're a clever translator.
Right. I wondered what you would say. We did, Terence Tilley and I did discuss the same question. And it would, in addition to being, I like the idea of sort of Dostoevsky taking a bow, hooray for my novel. In addition to that, it does seem fitting thematically to say hurrah for Karamazov in the sense of hurrah for the whole blessed mess of this of the Karamazov family, which is broader representation of humanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially out of the mouths of children, right? Which stand in Ivan's argument, well, whose suffering stands in Ivan's argument as a reason to curse the world, right? So to then put that praise of like, you know what, not just hooray for the good or hooray for the harmony, both of which Yvonne's not ready to admit. Like Job, they say, bless it all.
Yeah.
What I've had and lost, the grief that has come and filled my life, which has only at the end of my life perhaps turned to, from suffering into quiet joy, as Sima pronounces, right? So I like to leave it open to that possibility that it is an emphatic yes to the world as it is,
Mhm.
the world according to Leibniz and not the world according to Voltaire, so to speak,
Mhm.
right? Um,
Yes,
you believe that's also
I
justifiable
do.
as a point of translation. That's good to hear. So let's see. We have a few more minutes. I just want to ask a couple more questions here.
Sure.
Um,
I would say one more thing about the ending,
yes.
and that is the wonderful Sermon on the Mount, which Lyosha gives, standing on the rock, um, talking about memory and the importance of a
Mm.
childhood memory for resting one's faith on is so important. And that speech, to my mind, is probably the most memorable speech in the whole novel, as Alyosha goes on and talks about the importance of the childhood memory.
Right, and it's also I agree. It's also Zosima's teachings bearing fruit in the sense that, right, if you give a child a speck of light, right, with which to contest traumatic memories, then
Mm-hmm.
there's hope for that child, right? And this is one of those specks of light that they are giving one another at that moment. Would it be fair to say?
He, he's beginning his mission in the world. Uh, Father Zasim has been telling him to leave the monastery. He doesn't until finally Zosima's corpse smells so bad he has to leave the monastery. And that's I think, the literal manifestation of Zosima's power. That is, the reason he doesn't stink is to make Alyosha leave the monastery. Alyosha walks out of the room and then leaves the monastery 2 days later, and which is exactly what Zosima was predicting he should do, to go into the world. So here he's in the world with these boys, giving them his first sermon.
That's a lovely interpretation. So then that in that reading, it turns out that Zosima's corruption of the body is his final act of active love for
Yes.
Alyosha to
Mhm.
say,
For
leave.
Alyosha. It's
You have
exactly
to
what I
leave,
think. So
right?
everybody else, all the non-believers, are hoping for a miracle, and they don't see the real miracle which has taken place. That is, Zosima's corpse starts to smell and forces the hero of the novel out into the world. Thank you, Father Zosima.
Yes, and that evening, right after the reading of Cana of Galilee, he falls down to the earth and feels someone visited his soul in that hour,
Right.
right? The
Exactly.
silence of the heavens merges with the silence of the
Right.
earth. Someone visited
Beautiful,
his soul. Yes, that's
beautiful
lovely.
passage.
I love that interpretation. Um, well, we might have time for one more, and then we'll have some closing statements. Um, let's see here. Anatoly Yampolsky asks, pertaining to Zosima's philosophy of active love, I notice parallels between Kant's categorical imperatives and formula of humanity and his groundwork of metaphysics of morals. In your opinion, is Dostoevsky's concept of active love developed solely using Christianity, or could he have used Western philosophy to develop the idea as well? It's a big one.
Yes.
I say a
Um,
great one, a big one.
Philosophy 101 was my unfavorite course back in college, where we read Kant, and I'll be damned if I could understand exactly what he was on about. I think for Dostoevsky, it's really the religious source that is the most important. I don't think he's reckoning so much with Western philosophy.
Yeah,
Tolstoy is different. Tolstoy was better read and I think more uh, attuned to what was happening in Western thought. But I think Dostoevsky is really much more Russian in his approach.
fair enough. And maybe I could have warned you about this question, but since we're talking about Zosima, there's an interesting question that comes up because there's a tendency in certain periods of Russian history, right, to reduce vowels in certain parts of Russia and then to keep them as
Mhm.
full pronunciation. And there was a question, I looked into the pronunciation of Zosima, and if you ask any Russian, they'll tell you, no way can it be anything else other than Zosima that I've spoken with, because that's how it sounds to a Russian ear.
Right.
But the place where Zosima comes from, they oknuyut, right? Which meaning they pronounce their O's rather than reduce them. And there's that temptation to pronounce it that way, Zosima, because
Uh-huh.
it also puts emphasis on the life aspect of his name in Greek, right?
I see.
But also because it honors sort of this small place where he came from. So I don't know, would you say how do you tell your kids your students to pronounce that name?
He says Sima.
Yes, right.
I was unaware of the Orkanya of the locality.
It,
Um,
it plays out historically, but you will never hear Russians say it that
yeah,
you get
yeah,
chastised otherwise, right? Just a point, right, of interest.
sure
Uh,
it is.
yeah, it's been such a delight to speak with you, and I hope that we have occasion to meet again once you've completed your idiot translation. Be one of the first to read it, I'm sure, when
Thank you.
it's
Well, I thank you and your students for their questions. They are astute. I wish them well as they read the end of the novel and remain open. My email is mkatz@middlebury.edu, and I remain open should anybody have further questions. I love hearing from readers of my translations. So thank you
we'll
for
make
the interview and wish you well.
we'll make it a point to take you up on that offer.
Okay.
And I would like to thank Professor Michael Katz, our attendees who appreciate and contribute to our discussions, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center co-directors George Demakopoulos and Aristotle Papanikolaou for the platform, Associate Director Nathaniel Wood, who is also managing editor of the Studies Center's publication of scholarly research called Public Orthodoxy. And special thanks to Shivan Verletsa and Catherine Mandalakis for helping to organize and promote the event. If you are a Russian speaker, we will be holding a special session on Navalny and his legacy vis-a-vis Orthodoxy on April 26th. And that will be with Sister Vasa Larin and Sergei Chepnin. And that's coming up on Friday, April 26th at noon. Please join us or tell others who you might think would be interested. Thank you again, Professor Michael Katz. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome.
And hope
Thank
to
you.
talk soon.
Bye-bye.